The scream cut through the desert night like a blade through silk high, and desperate and utterly human. Thaddeus Bear McKinnon jerked awake in his bedroll, sweat already beating on his massive frame despite the cool air. Around him, the Black Dune Riders' camp, stirred with lazy, indifferent screams, were common enough in their line of work. "Shut that noise up," Dog-Eye Garrett muttered from across the dying campfire, his scarred face twisted in annoyance. "Some of us are trying to sleep." Bear sat up slowly, his eyes adjusting to the moonlit chaos around their temporary prison. The cage wagon squatted like a metal beast in the center of camp, its human cargo pressed against the bars in various states of despair. A young woman clutched a fevered child to her chest, rocking back and forth as she whispered desperate prayers into the desert wind. "Please," the woman called out, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "She's burning up. Just a little water." "Well, water's for paying customers, lady." Dog-Eye spat, rolling over to face away from the cage. "Your little brat ain't paid for nothing yet." Bear's massive hands clenched into fists, his knuckles popping like gunshots in the silence. 3 years riding with Crowley's gang had taught him to bury his conscience deep, but something about the woman's green eyes, the way they blazed with fierce maternal love, even in the face of horror, reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago. When the camp finally quieted and Dog-Eye's snores echoed off the canyon walls, Bear moved through the shadows like a ghost. His tin cup caught moonlight as he slipped it through the cage bars, the precious water inside, barely more than a few swallows. The woman Selena he'd heard her called looked up at him with those impossible green eyes. For a moment, that stretched like eternity, captor and captive, studied each other across the metal barrier that separated their worlds. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over her daughter's labored breathing. Bear had no answer. He'd been asking himself the same question for 3 years, ever since the night Jeremiah Crowley rode into his life, wearing the mask of salvation, and left him with nothing but blood on his hands and ice in his heart. But looking at this woman, at her daughter, who couldn't be more than 7, burning with fever in the unforgiving desert, Bear felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid since his sister May died alone while he was learning to be a monster. "Sleep," he said quietly, backing away from the cage. "Both of you. You'll need your strength for what's coming." He melted back into the darkness, leaving behind only the gift of water and a question that would haunt them both. In a world where mercy was weakness and kindness was suicide, what kind of man chose to be human anyway? The Rocking M Ranch had been everything to Thaddeus McKinnon, once 200 acres of promise carved out of the Arizona territory, complete with a small herd of cattle and dreams big enough to choke a horse. He'd worked sunrise to sunset building something decent, something his father would have been proud of. May helped when her lungs were good, sitting on the porch in the evenings, reading aloud from dime novels while Bear mended tack and planned their future. "You're gonna make this place famous someday." "Teddy," she'd say, using the childhood nickname that made him feel like the gentle giant she believed him to be. "Folks'll come from miles around just to see the spread that Bear McKinnon built." Those were the days when his size was a blessing instead of a curse, when his strength meant honest work instead of broken bones and intimidation. The neighboring ranchers respected him, and the banker in Tucson treated him fair. And Mary Littleton from the local school smiled whenever he tipped his hat to her on Sunday mornings. Everything changed the night Jeremiah Crowley rode into his life. Crowley arrived during the worst drought in memory, when the creek had turned to cracked mud and half the herd was already gone to disease. He came alone, his pale eyes taking inventory of every struggling animal, every unpainted board, every sign of impending failure. "Hard times," Crowley observed, settling into the porch chair May had vacated when her coughing fit started. "Heard tell the bank's getting anxious about your note." Bear had been defensive, at first suspicious of this well-dressed stranger who spoke with the smooth confidence of a snake oil salesman. But Crowley was patient, sympathetic, full of stories about his own struggles building a business in the territory. "Transportation," Crowley explained over coffee. that grew cold while May's coughing echoed from inside the house. Moving goods from place to place, helping folks who can't help themselves. It's profitable work for a man with your particular talents. What kind of goods? Bear had asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want the answer. Does it matter? Crowley's pale eyes glittered in the lamplight. Your sister needs medicine. The bank needs money. I need someone strong enough to make sure my cargo reaches its destination safely. Seems like a partnership made in heaven. Bear should have said no. Should have thrown Crowley off his land and found another way to save the ranch, save May, save the life he'd built with sweat and hope. Instead, he listened to his sister's labored breathing and nodded. One job, he said. Just one to get us through the worst of it. Crowley smiled and Bear's fate was sealed. The first cargo turned out to be a family of Chinese immigrants sold by corrupt customs officials and bound for the silver mines of Mexico. Bear told himself they were criminals, deserved whatever fate awaited them. But the children looked at him with the same fearful eyes May had worn during her worst nights, and something inside him began to die. By the time Bear returned from that first job, May was gone. Pneumonia, the doctor said, quick and brutal and final. The money Crowley paid bought medicine that arrived 2 days too late, and a funeral that nobody attended except Bear and the preacher. I'm sorry for your loss, Crowley said, appearing at Bear's elbow while the gravediggers finished their work. May was a good girl. Reminded me of my own sister. Bear looked at him through eyes red with grief and rage. You knew, didn't you? You knew she was dying when you offered me that job. I knew she needed help. Crowley replied carefully. Same as I know you need a place to belong now that she's gone. The ranch's forfeit banker told me this morning. But I've got work for a man with your skills, Bear. Good work, steady work. The alternative was wandering the territory as a hired hand, carrying May's death like a stone in his chest while he watched other men build the life he'd lost. Crowley offered something different purpose, belonging a family of sorts, even if that family traded in human misery. What do you say, Bear? Crowley extended his hand. Ready to make something of yourself? Bear took the hand and shook it, sealing his transformation from Thaddeus McKinnon, rancher and brother, into Bear McKinnon, enforcer and monster. That was 3 years ago. Now, watching Selena Morrison rock her fevered daughter in a cage built for animals, Bear wondered if May would recognize the man he'd become. Probably not. The gentle giant who'd read her stories and brought her wildflowers was buried somewhere deep beneath layers of violence and moral compromise. But tonight, for the first time in years, Bear felt him stirring. Selena caught his eye through the bars, her green gaze searching his face for signs of the humanity she'd glimpsed. What she saw there made her nod slightly. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement that the man behind the monster might still be worth saving. What's your daughter's name? Bear whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't being watched. Elsie. Selena replied, her voice soft with surprise. Elsie Morrison. Pretty name. Bear's throat tightened. My sister was May, about her age when she... He couldn't finish the sentence. I'm sorry, Selena said and meant it. Bear nodded and stepped back into the shadows, but her voice followed him. It's not too late, you know, to be who you were before all this. The words hit him like a physical blow. Bear wanted to tell her she was wrong, that some lines couldn't be uncrossed, some sins couldn't be forgiven. Instead, he found himself holding on to the possibility she offered like a drowning man, clutching driftwood. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe redemption was still possible even for someone like him. But first, he'd have to survive what was coming. And that would require becoming the monster one more time, long enough to save the people who'd reminded him he used to be a man. Dawn came like a bullet across the desert, sudden and violent and full of promise for the day's brutality. Bear was already awake, watching Elsie's small chest rise and fall in fitful rhythm, while her mother whispered prayers that went unanswered. The fever had broken sometime during the night, but the child remained weak and pale as morning light. "Mount up." Crowley's voice cut through the desert air like a whip crack. "We're burning daylight, and I want to make Devil's Canyon by sundown." The gang stirred to life around them. Dog-Eye Garrett spitting tobacco juice into the sand, the Cortez twins checking their weapons with mechanical precision. Jed One-Hand Larkin eyeing the prisoners like a hawk sizing up field mice. Bear had ridden with these men long enough to read their moods, and today something felt different. Hungrier, Boss, Dog-Eye, called out, his yellow eyes glittering with malice. "That Morrison woman's been giving our Bear here some mighty interested looks. Maybe we should have ourselves a little fun before we reach the trading post." Bear's blood turned to ice, but he kept his expression neutral. This was the game constant testing perpetual challenges to loyalty and ruthlessness. Show weakness, show compassion, and the pack would turn on you faster than rabid wolves. That's so. Crowley's pale eyes fixed on Bear with reptilian interest. "You've been making friends with the merchandise, Bear, just keeping them healthy." Bear replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Dead slaves don't bring top dollar." Crowley smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "True enough. But healthy slaves who've been broken properly bring even more. Dog-Eye, you handle the woman. Jed, you take the child. Show them what happens to cargo that gets ideas above its station." The two men moved toward the cage with predatory eagerness, and Bear saw his moment of truth arriving faster than a desert thunderstorm. In the cage, Selena pulled Elsie close, her green eyes blazing with the fury of a mother protecting her young. "No need for that," Bear said, stepping between the cage and Crowley's men. "They're already broken. Look at them." Dog-Eye paused, his scarred face twisting with disappointment. My boss said to keep them healthy for market." Bear interrupted, his massive frame blocking access to the cage. "Damaged goods bring damaged prices. You want to explain to Crowley why we're short $50 per head?" Jed's remaining hand dropped to his gun butt. "You questioning the boss's orders, Bear?" The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Every man in the camp was watching now, waiting to see if their gentle giant would finally show his true colors. Bear could feel Selena's eyes on him too, could almost hear her silent prayer that he'd make the right choice. "I'm questioning your hearing," Bear said evenly. "Boss said to break them proper, not break them permanent. There's a difference." Crowley laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like breaking glass. "Well said, Bear. I always did appreciate a man who pays attention to detail." His pale eyes swept over Dog-Eye and Jed with cold disapproval. "My enforcer's right. We're businessmen, not animals. Save your appetites for the cantinas in Devil's Canyon." The tension broke like a fever, but Bear knew he'd bought time more than safety. Dog-Eye's yellow eyes promised future reckoning, and Jed's single hand kept twitching toward his weapon. They'd remember this moment, file it away for later use. As the gang broke camp and prepared to move out, Bear found himself walking beside the cage wagon, where Selena sat holding her daughter. Elsie was awake now, her fever-bright eyes taking in the harsh landscape with the solemn attention of a child who'd seen too much too young. "Thank you," Selena whispered, her voice barely audible over the wagon's creaking wheels. Bear didn't reply, couldn't afford to be seen talking to the prisoners. But when Elsie reached through the bars to touch his hand, her small fingers warm and trusting against his calloused palm, something fundamental shifted inside him. He'd spent 3 years telling himself that survival justified anything, that May's death had freed him from the burden of being good. But this child's touch reminded him of another truth: some things were worth dying for. The realization terrified him more than any gun or gallows ever could. The Devil's Canyon. Dog Eyes said, riding up beside the wagon with a grin that showed too many broken teeth. Heard tell there's quicksand pools scattered all through that country. Real easy for folks to just disappear. The threat was clear enough. Bear nodded like he was discussing the weather, but his mind was already racing ahead to the canyon, mapping escape routes and calculating odds. If Dog Eye and Jed were planning something, it would happen there, away from witnesses, in country where bodies vanished without trace. You ever been to Devil's Canyon, Bear? Dog Eye continued, his voice thick with false camaraderie. Once or twice, Bear replied. Treacherous country, easy to lose your footing if you're not careful. Dog Eye's grin widened. Real easy, especially if someone gives you a little push. As they rode deeper into the wasteland, Bear felt the noose tightening around his neck with every mile. Behind him, Selena hummed a lullaby to her daughter, her voice soft and brave and heartbreakingly human. Ahead lay Devil's Canyon and whatever trap his former partners were preparing. But for the first time in 3 years, Bear McKinnon wasn't planning to just survive. He was planning to fight for redemption, for justice, and for two people who'd reminded him that being human was worth the risk. The only question was whether he'd remember how to be the man May had raised him to be, or if 3 years of being a monster had killed that person forever. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, and in its burning heart lay the answer to everything. Devil's Canyon earned its name honestly, a maze of red stone corridors and hidden sinkholes, where the desert's beauty turned deadly without warning. Bear had been here twice before, both times, leaving with fewer men than he'd arrived with. The rock formations created a natural echo chamber, turning whispers into shouts and making it impossible to tell where danger might be lurking. Crowley chose their campsite with his usual tactical precision, positioning the wagons near a natural spring, but with clear sight lines in all directions. The prisoner's cage sat in the center of the defensive ring, its human cargo wilting under the relentless afternoon sun. The water detail, Crowley announced, consulting his pocket watch with theatrical precision. Dog Eye, you and Jed take first shift. Bear, you're on prisoner watch. The assignments weren't random. Bear knew that much. Crowley was testing loyalties, creating opportunities for conflict, stirring the pot to see what bubbled to the surface. In the cage, Elsie Morrison was breathing in short, painful gasps, her fever returning with the heat of the day. She needs water, Selena said quietly, her green eyes meeting Bear's through the bars. Please. Bear glanced around the camp. Dog Eye and Jed were heading toward the spring, their voices carrying on the desert wind. The Cortez twins were checking weapons, and Crowley was studying his maps with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign. Can't, Bear replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Orders are orders. She's 7 years old. Selena whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. She's just a little girl. Bear looked at the child, really looked at her, and saw May in those fever-bright eyes. May gasping for breath in their cabin while he was off playing enforcer for a man who collected human misery like other people collected coins. He'd failed his sister. But maybe he didn't have to fail this child. Turn around, Bear said quietly. Don't watch the camp. Selena obeyed without question, using her body to shield Elsie from view, while Bear slipped his canteen through the bars. The water was warm and stale, but Elsie drank it like communion wine, her small throat working gratefully. Easy, Bear whispered. Not too fast. As the child drank, Bear found himself studying Selena's profile. The determined set of her jaw, the protective curve of her shoulders, the way she held herself like a shield between her daughter and the world's cruelties. She reminded him of someone, though he couldn't quite place who. You're not like them, Selena said softly, still facing away from the camp. Don't mistake necessity for kindness. Bear replied, but even he could hear the lie in his words. What was her name, your sister? The question hit him like a physical blow. How did you... The way you look at Elsie, like you're seeing someone else. Selena's voice was gentle understanding. Someone you lost. Bear was quiet for a long moment, listening to the desert wind whistle through the canyon walls. May. Her name was May. What happened to her? I wasn't there when she needed me. The words tasted like ashes in his mouth. I was off being what I thought I had to be, instead of being what she needed me to be. Selena nodded, still not turning around. And now, before Bear could answer, Dog Eye's voice cut through the canyon air like a blade. Well, what do we have here? Bear spun around to find Dog Eye and Jed approaching their faces, twisted with knowing grins. They'd returned from the spring, early moving quiet as hunting cats through the red stone maze. Just checking the prisoners, Bear said, stepping away from the cage. Sure you were. Dog Eye's yellow eyes glittered with malice. Looked mighty cozy from where we stood, almost like you were having yourself a conversation. Jed's remaining hand rested on his gun butt. Crowley ain't gonna like hearing about this, Bear. He's real particular about fraternizing with the merchandise. Bear's mind raced, calculating odds and angles. 2 against 1, both armed and expecting trouble. Behind him, he could hear Selena's quick breathing, could feel her fear radiating like heat from a forge. Nothing to tell Crowley, Bear said evenly. Just doing my job. Your job. Dog Eye laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the desert air. Your job is to keep them scared and compliant. Sharing water and having heart-to-hearts ain't exactly intimidating. Maybe our Bear's going soft. Jed suggested, his voice thick with false sympathy. Maybe he needs reminding about what happens to folks who cross the gang. They were working up to something. Bear could feel it building like pressure before a thunderstorm. In a few seconds, one of them would make a move, and everything would go to hell in a hurry. That's when Crowley appeared, materializing from behind a rock formation with the silent grace of a hunting spider. Problems, gentlemen. He asked, his pale eyes taking in the scene with reptilian calculation. I caught Bear here getting friendly with the prisoners, Dog Eye said quickly. Sharing water, having conversations. Real cozy. Crowley's gaze shifted to Bear, cold and measuring. That's so. Prisoner was dehydrated, Bear replied. Dead slaves don't bring money. True. Crowley moved closer to the cage, studying Selena and Elsie, with the dispassionate interest of a butcher examining cattle. Though I notice you didn't share water with the others. Just these 2. Any particular reason? The trap was closing like quicksand, inevitable and inescapable. Bear felt the weight of every choice he'd made, every compromise that had brought him to this moment. A child reminded me of someone, he said quietly. Someone I lost. Ah. Crowley nodded as if this explained everything. The sister you mentioned. May, wasn't it? Yes. Cor, and you think saving this child will somehow balance the scales? Make up for failing to save your sister? Bear met Crowley's pale eyes directly. No, nothing can do that. Then why risk everything for strangers? The question hung in the desert air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around them, the gang waited for an answer that would determine not just Bear's fate, but the fate of everyone in that cage. Because, Bear said finally, sometimes you reach a point where surviving ain't worth it anymore. Crowley smiled, and for the first time since Bear had known him, there was something like genuine emotion in his expression. Exactly what I wanted to hear. The pale-eyed man turned to Dog Eye and Jed, his voice cutting through their confusion like a scalpel. Kill him. The canyon exploded into violence as both men went for their guns, but Bear was already moving, his massive frame uncoiling like a released spring. He caught Dog Eye's wrist as the weapon cleared leather, twisting until bones snapped and the gun went flying into the rocks. Jed's shot went wide, the bullet sparking off stone as Bear drove his elbow into Dog Eye's throat. The scarred man dropped like a sack of grain, gasping and clawing at his crushed windpipe. Bear. Selena's warning came just in time. Bear threw himself sideways as Jed's second shot burned through the air where his head had been. The one-handed gunman was faster than Bear had expected, but desperation gave Bear speed of his own. He rolled behind the water trough splinters exploding around him as Jed's bullets chewed through the wooden planks. The other prisoners were screaming now, pressing themselves against the far side of their cage while lead flew like angry hornets. Enough. Crowley's voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. Jed, back off. The shooting stopped, leaving only the echo of gunfire bouncing off canyon walls and the sound of dog eyes, labored breathing. Bear peered over the shot-up trough to find Crowley standing calmly beside the cage, a nickel-plated derringer pressed against Elsie's small head. "Come out, Bear," Crowley said conversationally. "Unless you want to see what a 7-year-old's brains look like scattered across desert stone." Bear's heart stopped. In the cage, Selena was frozen with terror, her hands pressed against her mouth to hold back screams. Elsie looked confused, more than frightened, her fever-bright eyes wide with the incomprehension of childhood. "I'm coming out," Bear said, raising his hands as he stood. "Don't hurt her. That depends entirely on you." Crowley's pale eyes were utterly without mercy. "You see, Bear, I've been expecting this moment for quite some time. A man like you doesn't change his fundamental nature overnight, no matter how far he falls. The question was whether your conscience would reassert itself gradually or all at once." Bear stepped into the open, his massive frame casting shadows across the red stone. "Let them go, Crowley. Your quarrel's with me." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong." Crowley pressed the derringer harder against Elsie's head, making the child whimper. "My quarrel is with anyone who threatens my operation. And right now that includes this woman and her daughter. They're just prisoners. They're witnesses." Crowley interrupted. "They've seen you show mercy, watched you make choices that contradict everything the Black Dune Riders represent. That makes them dangerous." In the cage, Selena found her voice. "We won't tell anyone. Please just let us go. We'll disappear." Crowley laughed, the sound echoing off canyon walls like breaking glass. "My dear woman, you misunderstand the situation entirely. You're not going anywhere. None of you are." The gang leader's smile widened, showing teeth white as bleached bone. "You see, Bear's little crisis of conscience has given me a wonderful opportunity. I'm going to make an example of all three of you, a demonstration of what happens when someone betrays the Black Dune Riders." Bear felt the walls closing in around him, felt the weight of every mistake he'd ever made, pressing down like desert stone. But looking at Elsie's frightened face, at Selena's desperate courage, he realized something that changed everything. He wasn't trying to save them to make up for May's death. He was trying to save them because they were worth saving. Because in a world full of monsters, someone had to choose to be human, even if it killed him. "What do you want, Crowley?" Bear asked quietly. "What I've always wanted," Crowley replied. "Absolute loyalty. Complete obedience. The knowledge that my men will do whatever I ask, no matter how distasteful." The pale-eyed man gestured toward the cage with his free hand. "You're going to execute these prisoners, Bear. Both of them. Right here, right now, in front of the entire gang." Bear's blood turned to ice. "No. No." Crowley's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "That's not really an option. You see, if you refuse, I'll kill them anyway, slowly, creatively, and with considerably more pain than a quick bullet would provide. At least this way their deaths serve a purpose." The trap was perfect, inescapable as quicksand. Refuse and Selena and Elsie died in agony. Comply, and they died by his hand, making him complicit in their murder. But as Bear stared into Elsie's trusting eyes, he realized Crowley had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that Bear still valued his own survival above all else. "All right," Bear said quietly. "I'll do it." Selena's gasp of betrayal hit him like a physical blow, but Bear kept his expression neutral. Crowley smiled and stepped back, the derringer moving away from Elsie's head. Excellent. Jed, give Bear your gun. The one-handed man hesitated. Boss, maybe we should... Give him the gun. Crowley repeated his voice, carrying absolute authority. Jed tossed his revolver to Bear, who caught it with practiced ease. The weapon was fully loaded, 6 shots of death waiting to be unleashed. In the cage, Selena pulled Elsie close, whispering what sounded like final prayers. Bear raised the gun, sighting down the barrel at the woman who'd reminded him what it meant to be human. His hand was steady, his breathing controlled, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Any last words? Crowley asked, his voice thick with anticipation. Bear looked at Selena, memorizing the curve of her face, the fierce love in her green eyes, the way she held her daughter like a shield against the world's cruelties. Just one, he said quietly. Then he spun and put 3 bullets into Jed's chest before the one-handed man could blink. The canyon exploded into chaos as Crowley dove for cover, and the Cortez twins scrambled for their weapons. Bear was already moving, using his massive frame to shield the cage while bullets whined through the air around him. The key, he shouted to Selena. Crowley's got the key, but even as he said it, Bear knew they were trapped. The gang leader had vanished into the maze of red rock, taking their only hope of freedom with him. Dog-Eye was getting to his feet, his throat bruised but functional murder blazing in his yellow eyes. The rescue had become a siege, and Bear was outnumbered 3-1 with nowhere to run and no way to win. But looking at Elsie's brave little face, at Selena's blazing determination, Bear realized something that made him smile, despite their hopeless situation. For the first time in 3 years, he was fighting for something that mattered. Win or lose, live or die, he was finally being the man May had raised him to be. And that was worth any price the desert demanded. The Cortez twins moved like desert wolves, splitting up to flank Bear's position, while Dog-Eye circled wide through the rock maze. Bear crouched behind the shot-up water trough, his appropriated revolver down to 3 bullets, and his options dwindling fast. Can't hide forever, Bear. Dog-Eye's voice echoed off the canyon walls, impossible to pinpoint. We got all day and all the ammunition in the world. In the cage, Selena was working frantically at the lock, with a bent hairpin, her fingers flying over the mechanism, while Elsie kept watch. The other prisoners pressed themselves against the far wall, trying to make themselves invisible. I got it, Selena whispered as the lock clicked open. Elsie, stay close to... The crack of a rifle cut off her words, and splinters exploded from the cage frame, inches from her head. Pablo Cortez had found high ground on the canyon rim, his Winchester trained on the prisoners, like a vulture watching carrion. Nobody moves, he called down. Boss wants them alive for now. Bear cursed under his breath. The high ground gave Pablo perfect sight lines over the entire camp, making escape impossible. Worse, his brother Diego was somewhere in the rocks below, hunting Bear with the patience of a born killer. You're thinking too hard, amigo. Diego's voice drifted from the shadows, thick with false sympathy. Just give up. Make it easy on yourself. Bear studied the terrain, his mind racing through possibilities. The spring fed a narrow stream that wound deeper into the canyon, providing the only cover between their position and the maze beyond. But reaching it would mean crossing 30 yards of open ground under Pablo's rifle. Unless... Selena, Bear called quietly. Can you make smoke? She looked at him with confusion. Then understanding dawned. The prisoner bedding. It's dry enough to burn. Do it. When I give the signal, run for the stream bed. Stay low, keep moving, don't look back. Selena nodded and began gathering the filthy straw that served as bedding for the cage wagon. The other prisoners watched with growing hope as she twisted it into bundles that would burn hot and fast. What about you? She asked. Bear checked his remaining ammunition one more time. 3 bullets against 3 men with the high ground and superior firepower belonging to the enemy. The odds were worse than hopeless. I'll be right behind you, he lied. The first bundle of straw caught fire, immediately sending up a column of thick smoke that the desert wind grabbed and twisted into a gray curtain across the canyon floor. Pablo's rifle cracked from above, but the bullet went wide, striking stone, where shadows and smoke confused his aim. "Now," Bear shouted. Selena scooped up Elsie and ran for the stream bed, her feet flying over the rocky ground, while smoke swirled around them like ghostly protection. The other prisoners followed in a ragged line, stumbling and crying, but moving toward whatever hope the canyon might offer. Bear waited until they were halfway to safety before he broke cover, drawing fire from all three directions at once. Pablo's rifle sang from above, while Diego's pistol barked from the rocks and Dog-Eye's shotgun boomed like thunder. A slug burned across Bear's shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. He rolled behind a boulder and came up firing his first shot, taking Dog-Eye in the chest and dropping the scarred man like a sack of grain. 2 bullets left, 2 men remaining. Diego appeared from behind a rock formation, his pistol smoking in his hand. "Should have stayed hidden, Bear. Now you die slow." Bear's second shot caught Diego in the throat, cutting off his threats in a spray of blood and surprise. The gunman toppled backward into the rocks, his weapon clattering away into darkness. 1 bullet left, 1 man remaining. Pablo's rifle cracked again, the bullet striking the boulder that inches from Bear's head and filling the air with stinging stone fragments. The angle was impossible. Pablo could see him from above, but Bear couldn't get a clear shot at the canyon rim. Time to even the odds. Bear grabbed Dog-Eye's fallen shotgun and the dead man's ammunition belt, then began working his way through the rock maze toward the stream bed. Pablo's rifle followed him, bullets sparking off stone and whining through the desert air like angry hornets. "Run, coward!" Pablo shouted from above. "Run like the dog you are." Bear reached the stream bed to find Selena and the other prisoners huddled in a bend where the water had carved a shallow cave from the red stone. Elsie was shivering despite the heat, her fever returning with the stress and fear. "He's got us pinned," Selena said quietly. "We can't go forward or back." Bear studied the canyon walls, looking for inspiration in the blood-red stone. The geology was unstable here, layers of sandstone and shale that had been carved by flash floods and baked by desert sun until they were brittle as old bones. "Maybe we don't have to move," he said thoughtfully. Working quickly, Bear began placing charges from Dog-Eye's ammunition belt along a crack in the canyon wall. The gunpowder wasn't ideal for demolition work, but packed properly and detonated together, it might be enough to bring down a section of the unstable rock face. "What are you doing?" Selena asked. "Creating a distraction." Bear finished his improvised mining work and began backing away from the charges. "When this goes up, you run. Follow the stream deeper into the canyon. It'll lead you to the old trading post." "What about you?" Bear looked at her green eyes, memorizing the way they caught the desert light, the fierce intelligence that blazed there, even in the face of certain death. "Someone's got to make sure Pablo doesn't follow," he said simply. Before she could protest, Bear struck a match and touched it to the makeshift fuse he'd created from torn fabric and gunpowder. The flame raced along the cloth like a living thing, disappearing into the crack where he'd placed his charges. "Go!" he shouted, pushing Selena toward the deeper canyon. "Now!" The explosion shook the entire canyon, sending a cascade of red stone tumbling down the cliff face in a thunderous avalanche. Pablo's screams were cut short as tons of rock buried his position, filling the air with choking dust and the rumble of shifting stone. When the dust settled, the canyon had been transformed. Where once there had been a clear path back to the gang's camp, now there was only a wall of broken rock 30 feet high. They were cut off from pursuit, but they were also trapped in the deeper canyon with no way back. "Is he dead?" Selena asked, coughing in the dust-filled air. Bear studied the rockfall, looking for any sign of movement. A hand protruded from beneath the stones, Pablo's hand still and lifeless. "Yeah," Bear said quietly, "he's dead." But even as he spoke, Bear knew their troubles were far from over. Crowley was still alive somewhere in this maze of stone, and the gang leader was too smart to let them escape. He'd be waiting, planning, using the canyon's geography against them. "We need to move," Bear said, helping Elsie to her feet. "Crowley knows this country better than anyone. If we stay here, he'll find us." They followed the stream deeper into the canyon, the other prisoners strung out behind them, like a ragged caravan of the damned. The water grew shallower with each mile, eventually disappearing entirely into the thirsty sand. There. Selena pointed ahead to where ancient stone walls rose from the desert floor. The trading post. But as they approached the ruins, Bear's blood turned to ice. Fresh horse tracks circled the building, and smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was waiting for them? It's a trap, he said quietly. Of course it is. The voice came from behind them, cold and familiar as winter death. Bear spun around to find Crowley standing on a rock ledge 20 feet above his pale eyes, glittering with malevolent satisfaction. The gang leader held a rifle with casual competence, its barrel trained on the group below. Did you really think you could outrun me in my own territory? Crowley continued, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. I've been using these ruins for years. Every trail, every hiding spot, every bolt hole, I know them all. Bear stepped protectively in front of Selena and Elsie, his hand moving to the shotgun at his side. But the angle was wrong, the distance too great for the scattergun's limited range. Let them go, Bear called up. They're no threat to you now. On the contrary, Crowley replied. They're the greatest threat I've ever faced. Not because of what they can do, but because of what they represent. The pale-eyed man began picking his way down the rock face, his rifle never wavering from its targets. You see, Bear, I've built my reputation on the absolute certainty that my men will follow orders without question. But you've introduced doubt into the equation. You've shown them that conscience is possible, that redemption exists. Crowley reached the bottom of the cliff and began advancing across the open ground, his movements deliberate and unhurried. That kind of thinking is contagious. It spreads like wildfire through an organization, turning loyal soldiers into weak-willed philosophers. I can't allow that. So you'll murder innocent people to protect your reputation? Bear asked. I'll murder anyone necessary to protect my business, Crowley corrected. Starting with the woman and child who've corrupted my best enforcer. The rifle swung toward Selena and Elsie, death incarnate in polished steel and walnut stock. Bear saw the moment crystallize like glass. Saw Crowley's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the muzzle flash that would end 2 innocent lives. Time slowed to a crawl as Bear threw himself sideways, his massive frame intercepting the bullet meant for Selena. The slug hit him high in the chest, spinning him around and driving him to his knees in the red sand. Bear! Selena's scream cut through the desert air like a blade. But Bear was already moving again, ignoring the fire in his chest as he brought up the shotgun. Crowley was working the rifle's bolt action, chambering another round with mechanical precision. Too slow. Bear's shotgun roared the spreading pattern of buckshot, catching Crowley's center mass and lifting him off his feet. The gang leader hit the ground hard, his rifle flying away into the rocks. But as Bear struggled to his feet, he saw the truth in Crowley's pale eyes. The man was dying, but he wasn't finished. A nickel-plated derringer had appeared in his hand, its twin barrels seeking targets with desperate malice. If I die, Crowley gasped, blood frothing at his lips, you all die with me. The derringer swung toward Elsie's small form, and Bear knew he was too far away, too badly wounded, too late to stop what was coming. That's when Selena Morrison showed him what real courage looked like. She threw herself between the gun and her daughter, her arms spread wide like a shield of flesh and bone. The derringer cracked once, twice, both barrels emptying their venom into her body. Selena crumpled to the sand, her green eyes already glazing over as life ebbed away in red streams. But her sacrifice had bought Bear the seconds he needed. His second shotgun blast erased Crowley from existence, scattering the gang leader's remains across the ancient stones. Mama, Elsie's cry pierced the sudden silence like a knife through silk. Mama, wake up! Bear crawled across the sand to where Selena lay dying, his own wound, forgotten in the face of her sacrifice. Her eyes found his still blazing with fierce intelligence, despite the growing darkness. Take care of her. she whispered, her voice growing fainter with each word. Promise me you'll take care of her. I promise. Bear set his throat tight with grief and rage. I swear it. Selena smiled, and then her hand reaching up to touch his face with surprising gentleness. You're a good man, Thaddeus McKinnon. Don't let anyone tell you different. Her eyes closed and she was gone. Bear knelt in the sand beside her body, holding Elsie as the child sobbed against his chest. Around them, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and terrible, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. But in that moment of absolute loss, Bear felt something crystallize inside him. The guilt and self-hatred that had driven him for 3 years was burning away, replaced by something harder and cleaner. Purpose. Selena Morrison had died believing he was a good man. Now he'd spend the rest of his life proving her right. The old trading post squatted against the canyon wall like a wounded animal, its adobe walls cracked and weathered by decades of desert storms. Bear carried Elsie in his arms, while the other freed prisoners followed in exhausted silence, their hope tempered by the fresh grief of Selena's sacrifice. Is Mama really gone? Elsie whispered against his shoulder, her small voice breaking what was left of his heart. Yeah, little one. Bear replied, his voice rough with emotion. She's gone. But even as he spoke, the words, something nagged at him. A detail from the trading post that didn't fit the abandoned ruin it appeared to be. The smoke from the chimney had been too white, too clean for old wood. And the horse tracks around the building were too fresh, too numerous for a single gang leader's mount. Bear set Elsie down gently beside the stone well and drew his remaining weapon, the shotgun he'd taken from Dog Eye's corpse. One shell left and a growing certainty that they'd need it. Stay close to the well, he told the prisoners. Something's not right here. He was moving toward the trading post's main entrance when the door swung open and a figure stepped into the harsh desert light. Bear's blood turned to ice as he recognized the weathered face and missing left hand. Jed, one-hand Larkin, stood in the doorway, very much alive, despite the 3 bullets Bear had put in his chest. A crude bandage covered his torso, dark with dried blood, but his remaining hand held a Colt revolver steady as mountain stone. Surprised to see me, Bear? Jed asked, his voice thick with pain and malicious satisfaction. Takes more than a few bullets to kill a Larkin. Ask anyone who's tried. Behind Jed, more figures emerged from the trading post, hard-faced men with the lean look of professional killers. Bear counted 6 of them, all armed, all watching him with the patient hunger of wolves sizing up prey. You see, Bear? Jed continued, limping forward on unsteady legs. Crowley wasn't the only one with plans for this canyon. I've been building my own operation, gathering men who understand that the old ways ain't working anymore. The revelation hit Bear like a physical blow. You were working against Crowley? All along. Smart, man. Yeah, I was undermining that pale-eyed bastard every chance I got. Feeding information to rivals, sabotaging jobs, recruiting his best people. Jed's grin showed blood-stained teeth. The Black Dune Riders were finished whether you turned on us or not. One of the new men stepped forward, a Mexican with silver conchos on his gun belt and scars mapping his face like a road atlas. Jefe, we should move. The federales have been asking questions in Nogales. Patience, Ramirez, Jed replied. I got personal business to finish first. Bear raised the shotgun, but 6 weapons swung toward him in response. The math was simple and brutal, 1 shot against 6 men with innocent lives caught in the crossfire. Now, here's what's going to happen, Jed said conversationally. You're going to put that scattergun down real gentle-like, and then we're going to have ourselves a conversation about loyalty and consequences. What do you want, Jed? What I've always wanted. Respect, recognition. A place at the top of the food chain instead of scraping by on Crowley's table scraps. Jed's eyes glittered with fanatic intensity. But first, I want to watch you suffer the way I've been suffering. The one-handed man gestured toward his followers. Boys, take the prisoners, all of them. We'll sort out the valuable ones later. No, Bear said quietly. Must know. Jed laughed, the sound harsh and broken. You're in no position to be giving orders, Bear. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and bleeding from that hole in your chest. Face facts, you lost. But even as Jed spoke, Bear noticed something that changed everything. The horse tracks around the trading post weren't just fresh, they were wrong. Too many horses for the number of men he could see, and some of the tracks showed the distinctive marks of cavalry horseshoes. Military horses, federal horses. Bear smiled, and the expression made Jed take an involuntary step backward. You're right about one thing, Bear said, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon floor. I am outnumbered, but so are you. The crack of a rifle echoed off the canyon walls, and one of Jed's men spun around and dropped, clutching his shoulder. More shots followed, coming from the rim rock above the trading post. A Federal Marshal. A voice boomed from the heights. You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons. The canyon exploded into chaos as Jed's men scrambled for cover, their carefully laid trap becoming a killing ground. Bear grabbed Elsie and dove behind the stone well as bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. How? Jed screamed from behind an overturned wagon. How did they find us? Bear smiled grimly as he watched the one-handed man's empire crumble around him. Because you're not the only one who can plan ahead. The truth was simpler than Jed could have imagined. Bear had been leaving signs for days, broken branches, stone cairns, scratches on canyon walls. Not random damage, but a trail any competent tracker could follow. He'd been hoping for rescue, but expecting death. The Federales had other ideas. Marshal William Harrison appeared at the canyon rim, his badge glinting in the desert sun. Thaddeus McKinnon, you're under arrest for crimes against the territory of Arizona. What? Jed's remaining men looked at each other in confusion. They're here for Bear. The pieces fell into place with crystalline clarity. The Federales hadn't been tracking Jed's gang, they'd been tracking Bear himself, following the trail he'd left for whatever rescue might come. The bounty on his head had drawn lawmen from 3 territories, turning his hoped-for salvation into another trap. But sometimes, Bear reflected as bullets flew overhead, one trap could spring another. Marshal, Bear called out. I've got information on the Larkin gang's safe passage for testimony. Harrison's rifle cracked again, dropping another of Jed's men. What kind of information? Everything: routes, contacts, hideouts, the whole network. Jed's face went white with rage and betrayal. You son of a bitch, you planned this. No. Bear replied, pulling Elsie closer as ricochets sparked off the stone well. But I'm smart enough to adapt when opportunities present themselves. The gunfight raged for another 10 minutes before Jed's surviving men threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The one-handed gang leader himself was the last to surrender, his Colt empty and his dreams of empire bleeding out in the desert sand. Marshal Harrison climbed down from the rim rock, his weathered face grim with professional satisfaction. Thaddeus McKinnon, you're under arrest for armed robbery, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. Bear stood slowly, his hands raised, Elsie clinging to his leg like a frightened kitten. I understand, Marshal, but I've got conditions. You're not in a position to make conditions. The child, Bear said, gesturing toward Elsie. She's got no one left. I want assurance she'll be cared for properly. Harrison looked down at the little girl, his stern expression softening slightly. There's an orphanage in Tucson. Good people, no orphanage. Bear's voice carried absolute finality. She stays with me or the deal's off. You're going to prison, McKinnon, maybe for life. Then she visits me in prison. Whatever it takes. Bear knelt down to Elsie's level, his massive hands gentle on her small shoulders. I made a promise to her mother. I intend to keep it. Marshal Harrison studied the scene, the deadly enforcer kneeling in the sand, and the orphaned child who'd wrapped her arms around his neck. the other freed prisoners watching with hope and fear in their eyes. "We'll work something out," Harrison said finally. "But first, you're going to tell me everything you know about every gang, every hideout, every criminal operation from here to the Mexican border." Bear nodded, understanding the price of his redemption. Everything, every last detail. As the federales secured the prisoners and prepared for the long journey back to civilization, Bear felt the weight of 3 years' worth of crimes settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. There would be trials, imprisonment, possibly execution. Justice demanded payment, and he was finally ready to pay it. But holding Elsie's small hand as they walked out of Devil's Canyon, Bear realized something that made even the prospect of the gallows bearable. For the first time since May's death, he was exactly where he belonged, protecting someone who needed him, being the man his sister had raised him to be. Selena Morrison had died believing he was good. Now he'd spend whatever time remained proving her faith wasn't misplaced. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, beautiful and terrible and full of possibility. In its burning heart lay the future, uncertain, dangerous, but finally genuinely his own. The territorial prison in Yuma squatted on the Colorado River like a brick and stone tumor, its walls radiating heat that made the surrounding desert seem cool by comparison. Bear had been there for 6 months, serving as a star witness in the trials that were dismantling criminal networks across the Southwest. His cell was small but clean, with a narrow window that looked out on the exercise yard where other inmates shuffled through their daily routines like ghosts of the men they'd once been. But Bear's routine was different every morning. He was escorted to the warden's office, where federal prosecutors grilled him about names, dates, locations, and methods. "Tell us about the Tucson bank job." Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Crenshaw said, her pen poised over a legal pad. "Who planned it? How was the information obtained?" Bear stared at the woman across the oak desk, noting the intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, the determined set of her jaw. She reminded him of Selena in some ways, fierce, uncompromising, absolutely dedicated to protecting the innocent. "Jimmy the Weasel Martinez planned it," Bear replied. He had a contact inside the bank, a teller named Roberts, who was deep in debt to a gambling house. Roberts provided the schedule for large cash transfers. Crenshaw made notes with swift, precise strokes. "How do you know this?" "Because I was the one who scared Roberts into cooperating. Crowley sent me to his house one night to convince him." The memory tasted like ashes. Bear had done exactly what he'd been ordered to do, using his size and reputation to terrorize a desperate man into betraying his employers. Another link in the chain of crimes that had brought him to this place. "We'll need details," Crenshaw said. "Everything you can remember." This was Bear's life, now excavating his own sins, laying them bare for the law's judgment. In exchange, he'd received a sentence of 15 years instead of the hangman's noose. And more importantly, he'd been allowed to maintain contact with Elsie Morrison. The child visited every week, brought by Mrs. Catherine Winters, a widow from Tucson, who'd agreed to serve as Elsie's guardian. Bear cherished those visits more than freedom itself. Watching the little girl grow and change, helping her with reading lessons, listening to her stories about school and friends, and the normal life that had seemed impossible during those dark days in Devil's Canyon. "Mr. Bear," Elsie said during one visit, her small face pressed against the bars of the visiting room. "Mrs. Winters says I can't come see you anymore." Bear's blood turned to ice. "What? Why not?" "Some people in town are saying bad things. About you, about me, about Mrs. Winters for bringing me here." Elsie's eyes filled with tears. "They say I shouldn't be around someone like you." The words hit Bear like physical blows. He'd known this day would come, the day when his past would reach out to poison the only good thing left in his life. But he'd hoped for more time, hoped that his cooperation with the law would buy him some measure of acceptance. "Listen to me, little one." Bear said, his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest. "Mrs. Winters is a good woman, and she's trying to do what's best for you. If people are giving her trouble, I don't want to stop coming." Elsie interrupted, her small hands gripping the bars with desperate strength. "You're all I have left of Mama. She made you promise to take care of me." Bear's throat tightened. "I'm still taking care of you. Even if I can't see you, I'm still keeping that promise." But even as he spoke, the words Bear knew they were hollow comfort. Without his visits, without his presence in her life, Elsie would grow up surrounded by whispers and sideways glances. She'd carry the stigma of association with him forever, just as he carried the weight of his crimes. That night alone in his cell, Bear made a decision that would change everything. He requested a meeting with Warden Samuel Morrison, no relation to Selena, despite the shared name. Morrison was a hard man with gray eyes and a reputation for fairness tempered by absolute inflexibility. "You wanted to see me, McKinnon?" Morrison asked, settling behind his desk, like a judge preparing to render verdict. "I want to make a deal," Bear said. "A new deal. You're already cooperating fully with federal prosecutors. What more could you possibly offer?" Bear leaned forward, his massive frame dwarfing the wooden chair. "I want to hunt down the remaining gang members, the ones who scattered when Crowley and Jed went down. I can find them, bring them in, finish the job properly." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "You're talking about leaving prison to work as a bounty hunter. I'm talking about redemption." Bear's voice carried absolute conviction. "I helped create these monsters. Now I want to help destroy them. In exchange for what? Freedom for Elsie Morrison. A chance for her to grow up without my shadow hanging over her." Bear's hands clenched into fists. "She doesn't deserve to suffer for my sins." The warden studied Bear with calculating eyes. "You understand what you're asking. You'd be giving up any chance of reduced sentence, any hope of early parole. You'd be walking into situations where you'd almost certainly be killed. I understand. And you'd be doing it alone. No federal backing, no official authority, just you against men who'd shoot you on sight." Bear smiled, and there was something terrible in the expression. "I've been alone before." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the desktop. "There's a man named Carlos Mendoza," he said finally. "Ran with your old gang before branching out on his own. He's been hitting silver shipments between here and Phoenix, killed 3 guards last month. I know Mendoza, vicious but not particularly smart. There's a $1,000 bounty on his head, dead or alive." Morrison's gray eyes met Bear's directly. "Bring him in and we'll talk about your proposal." Bear nodded. "When do I leave?" "Tomorrow morning." "But McKinnon." Morrison's voice carried a warning. "If you run, if you disappear into Mexico or parts unknown, that little girl will suffer for it. There are people in this territory who won't forget your connection to her." "I won't run," Bear said quietly. "I gave my word." The next morning, Bear walked out of Yuma prison wearing civilian clothes and carrying a gun belt that felt strange after months of confinement. His horse was a rangy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and the scarred hide of an animal that had survived hard country. One week, Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley said, handing Bear a badge that read, "Special Agent. You don't report back in 7 days, we come looking for you." Bear pinned the badge to his vest, feeling the weight of law and responsibility settle on his shoulders. "You won't need to look far." He rode east into the desert, following trails that existed more in memory than on any map. Mendoza was hiding in the Superstition Mountains, using the maze of canyons and hidden valleys to avoid pursuit. But Bear knew that country, knew the water sources and escape routes that made it a perfect hideout. He found Mendoza's camp on the 3rd day, tucked into a box canyon with a dozen stolen horses and enough supplies for a month-long siege. The outlaw himself was exactly as Bear remembered, small, dark, with the quick movements of a man who'd survived by being faster and more vicious than his enemies. "I'm Bear McKinnon," Mendoza called out as Bear rode into the canyon. "Heard you were in prison. Heard you were cooperating with the law." I heard right on both counts. Bear replied, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Now I'm here to take you back. Mendoza laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You always were too stupid to know when you were beaten. How many men you think I got hidden in these rocks? Bear studied the canyon walls, noting the glint of rifle barrels and the subtle movements that betrayed concealed positions. 4, maybe 5. Not enough. Not enough. Mendoza's hand dropped to his weapon. You're one man, Bear. 1 man against 6. That's where you're wrong. Bear said, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon floor. I'm not just 1 man anymore. The badge on his vest caught the desert sun, throwing reflected light across the canyon walls like a beacon. And in that moment, Bear felt the weight of law and justice and righteous purpose filling the empty spaces in his soul. I'm the law, he said simply, and the law doesn't lose. The gunfight was swift and brutal. Mendoza's men were good, but they were fighting for money and survival. Bear was fighting for redemption, for the memory of a woman who died believing in his goodness, for a little girl who deserved better than the shadow of his crimes. When the smoke cleared, 4 men were dead, and 2 were wounded but alive. Mendoza himself lay in the sand, with a bullet through his chest, his eyes wide with the surprise of someone who'd never expected to face consequences for his actions. Should have stayed in prison, Bear, he gasped. Should have served your time quiet and grateful. Maybe, Bear replied, kneeling beside the dying outlaw. But some promises are worth more than safety. He brought Mendoza's body back to Yuma, draped over a pack horse, along with the 2 wounded survivors, and enough evidence to close a dozen unsolved cases. The $1,000 bounty was deposited in an account for Elsie's education, and Bear's reputation as a man who kept his word began spreading through the territory. 1 down, Warden Morrison said as Bear turned in his badge. How many more? Bear thought about the list of names he carried in his head, the former associates who'd scattered like cockroaches when the Black Dune Riders fell apart. Some had joined other gangs, others had gone into business for themselves. All of them were living free while their victims moldered in desert graves. All of them, Bear said. However many it takes. That night, back in his cell, Bear received a letter from Mrs. Winters. Elsie was doing well in school, making friends, slowly healing from the trauma of losing her mother. The townspeople were starting to accept her, helped by the news that her protector was working with the law instead of against it. She asks about you every day, Mrs. Winters had written. I tell her you're doing important work making the world safer for children like her. She's proud of you, Mr. McKinnon. We all are. Bear folded the letter carefully and placed it under his pillow alongside the pressed flower Elsie had given him in Devil's Canyon. Small tokens of hope in a world that had shown him precious little mercy. But mercy, he was learning, wasn't something you received. It was something you earned, 1 choice at a time, 1 promise, kept 1 life saved. And Bear McKinnon had a lot of earning still to do. The mining town of Bitter Creek, perched on the mountainside like a scab on wounded earth, its ramshackle buildings connected by muddy streets, and the desperate hope that tomorrow's silver strike would be bigger than today's. Bear rode into town just as the sun was setting behind the peaks, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him with ghostly fingers. This was his 5th hunt in as many months, and each one had been harder than the last. The remaining members of Crowley's scattered gang were the smartest and the most vicious, the ones who'd learned to blend into normal society while continuing their predatory ways. Vincent the Preacher Calhoun was all 3. Bear hitched his horse outside the Silver Dollar Saloon and stepped through the batwing doors into a world of smoke and whiskey and barely controlled violence. The patrons were a mix of miners, gamblers, and hard cases, all of them eyeing the newcomer with the casual suspicion of men who lived by their guns. You're Bear McKinnon, said a voice from the shadows near the bar. Bear turned to see a man in a black suit and clerical collar, his pale hands folded peacefully in front of him. Vincent Calhoun looked every inch the traveling preacher he claimed to be until you saw his eyes. They were the color of winter ice, utterly without warmth or mercy. Preacher. Bear acknowledged his hand resting near his gun. Heard you were spreading the word in these parts? Calhoun smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. The word of redemption, Brother McKinnon. The possibility that even the most lost souls can find salvation. That why you've been robbing stages and murdering passengers for their salvation. The saloon went quiet, conversations dying as men sensed the electric tension building between the two killers. Calhoun's smile never wavered, but his pale eyes went even colder. Careful what you accuse a man of, brother, especially a man of God. You're no more a man of God than I am. Bear said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. You're a killer who hides behind a collar, nothing more. Calhoun's hand moved toward the gun concealed beneath his coat, but Bear was ready. The Colt appeared in his hand. Like magic, its barrel trained on the false preacher's chest. Don't, Bear said quietly. Please don't make me kill you in front of all these people. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the smoke-filled saloon. Then Calhoun's hand moved away from his weapon, his smile returning like a mask, sliding back into place. You're making a mistake, Brother McKinnon. I'm not the man you think I am. Then you won't mind coming with me to answer some questions. I'm afraid I have prior commitments. Calhoun gestured toward the stairs leading to the saloon's second floor. A young lady is waiting for me. A business arrangement, you understand. Bear's blood turned to ice. What young lady? A pretty little thing. Auburn hair, green eyes, very spirited. Calhoun's smile widened. Reminded me of someone, though I can't quite place who. The world went red around the edges as Bear realized what was happening. Calhoun had taken a hostage, someone who looked like Selena, someone chosen specifically to throw him off balance. Where is she? Bear demanded. Safe for now. But time is running short, brother. Every second you waste down here is a second closer to unpleasantness upstairs. Bear's mind raced through possibilities. The saloon had two exits, front and back, but the stairs were in the middle of the room, impossible to reach without crossing open space. Calhoun would be upstairs by now, using his hostage as a shield. What do you want? Bear asked. What I've always wanted. A fair fight between men of honor. Calhoun's pale eyes glittered with malicious amusement. Meet me in the street, brother. High noon tomorrow. Winner takes all. And if I refuse, then the young lady pays the price for your cowardice. Bear holstered his weapon, his jaw clenched tight with suppressed rage. If you hurt her, I'm a man of God, Brother McKinnon. I don't hurt innocent people. Calhoun's smile was razor thin. Unless they give me reason to. The false preacher backed toward the stairs, his movements smooth and confident. Until tomorrow, then. I'll be praying for your soul. Bear waited until Calhoun disappeared upstairs, then moved to the bar where the bartender was polishing glasses with hands that shook slightly. The woman, Bear said quietly. How long has she been here? Came in this morning on the stage from Phoenix. The bartender replied. Said she was looking for someone. That preacher offered to help her find him. What's her name? Sarah something. Sarah. Morrison, I think. Bear's heart stopped. Morrison was Selena's maiden name, the name Elsie had taken when Mrs. Winters adopted her. But that was impossible. Elsie was safe in Tucson, going to school, living the normal life her mother had died to give her. Unless, Bear grabbed the bartender's arm. How old was she, the woman? Young, maybe 15, 16. Why? The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Elsie hadn't been content to stay in Tucson while her protector risked his life hunting outlaws. She'd run away, followed his trail, walked straight into the trap Calhoun had prepared. Son of a bitch, Bear whispered. The bartender leaned closer. You know her. She's my daughter. Bear lied the words, feeling strange on his tongue. But in every way that mattered, it was true. Elsie Morrison was the only family he had left, the only good thing in a world full of darkness. And now she was upstairs with a killer who wore God's collar like a costume. Bear spent the night in the stable behind the saloon, cleaning his weapons and trying to plan for a fight he couldn't win. Calhoun was faster than most men Bear had faced. But more than that, he was smart. This whole scenario was a carefully constructed trap designed to force Bear into a situation where his emotions would override his tactical judgment. It was working perfectly. Dawn came like a blade across the mountains, and with it the sound of church bells calling the faithful to worship. Bear checked his Colt one final time, then walked into the empty street where Vincent Calhoun waited. The false preacher stood in front of the town's small church, his black suit immaculate, despite the dusty surroundings. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalks, miners and shopkeepers who'd heard about the challenge and come to witness the show. The Brother McKinnon. Calhoun called out his voice, carrying the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to speaking to crowds. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve. Where's the girl? Bear demanded. Calhoun gestured toward the church's bell tower, where a figure could be seen pressed against the narrow window. Even at this distance, Bear could make out auburn hair and the familiar shape of Elsie's face, safe and sound. Calhoun said with mock piety. Though I'm afraid the rope around her neck might prove problematic if anything happens to me. Bear's vision went red. You sick bastard. Language, Brother McKinnon. We're standing on holy ground. Calhoun's pale eyes glittered with malevolent amusement. Now, shall we settle this like gentlemen? Or would you prefer to explain to the good people of Bitter Creek why their church burned down with an innocent girl inside? The trap was perfect in its cruelty. Win the gunfight and Calhoun's accomplices would kill Elsie. Lose, and she'd die anyway, once the false preacher no longer needed a hostage. There was no good choice, no clean victory. But Bear had learned something in his months of hunting outlaws. Sometimes the only way to win was to change the rules of the game. All right, Bear said, raising his hands in apparent surrender. You win. I'll face you. Calhoun's smile widened. I knew you'd see reason. Now shall we observe the traditional courtesies? Back-to-back 20 paces turn and fire. Whatever you want. Bear replied, moving toward the center of the street. They stood back-to-back in the dusty thoroughfare, the morning sun casting their shadows like dark fingers across the ground. Bear could feel Calhoun's breathing, could sense the coiled tension in the false preacher's frame. 20 paces. Calhoun said, his voice carrying to the watching crowd. On my count. They began walking, each step taking them further apart. Bear counted the paces in his head, but his attention was focused on the church bell tower and the small figure visible in its window. 10, Calhoun called out. Bear's hand drifted casually toward his gun, but not to draw it. Instead, he palmed the small mirror he'd taken from his saddlebags, a piece of polished steel that would reflect the morning sun like a beacon. 15. Bear angled the mirror toward the bell tower, catching the sunlight and sending a brilliant flash toward the window, where Elsie waited. Once, twice, 3 times the signal he'd taught her during their visits to the prison. 20. Turn and... Calhoun spun around his gun, clearing leather with practiced speed. But Bear wasn't standing where he was supposed to be. The moment he'd sent the signal, he'd thrown himself sideways, rolling behind a water trough as Calhoun's bullet whined through empty air. The diversion worked exactly as Bear had hoped. In the bell tower, Elsie had been waiting for his signal, her small hands gripping the rope that held the church bell in place. When she saw the reflected sunlight, she pulled with all her strength. The massive bronze bell came crashing down through the wooden floor of the tower, its thunderous toll drowning out Calhoun's scream of rage. More importantly, its fall created chaos in the tower, buying Elsie precious seconds to escape whatever trap had been prepared for her. Bear came up from behind the water trough, with his Colt in hand, but Calhoun was already moving, diving for cover behind the church steps. The false preacher's pale face was twisted with fury as he realized his carefully laid plan was crumbling. You think you're so clever? Calhoun screamed over the echoing bell toll. But she's still going to die. Miguel Carlos, kill the girl. Gunshots erupted from the church, but they weren't aimed at Elsie. Bear's smile widened as he realized his signal had worked even better than planned. Elsie hadn't been alone in that tower. She'd been sharing it with two of Calhoun's men, both of whom were now dealing with a several hundred-pound bronze bell that had crushed their hiding place. "Elsie," Bear called out, "are you all right?" "I'm fine," came the reply from somewhere inside the church. "But there's a lot of broken wood up here." Calhoun's face went white with rage and disbelief. "Impossible. You couldn't have planned this." "I didn't," Bear replied, advancing on the false preacher's position. "But I taught that girl to be ready for anything, and I taught her to trust me." The final gunfight was brief and brutal. Calhoun was fast, but he was also desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. His shot went wide, striking the church wall inches from Bear's head. Bear's shot found its mark, taking the false preacher center mass and dropping him to the dusty street. As Calhoun lay dying, Bear knelt beside him close enough to hear his whispered final words. "You think this makes you righteous?" Calhoun gasped, blood frothing at his lips. "You're still a killer, McKinnon. Still a monster." "Maybe," Bear replied quietly. "But I'm a monster with a purpose now. And that makes all the difference." Elsie appeared in the church doorway, dusty and shaken, but unharmed. She ran to Bear and threw her arms around him, her small body trembling with relief and residual fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I know you told me to stay in Tucson, but I was worried about you. I heard the men in town talking about how dangerous these hunts were becoming." Bear held her tight, feeling the weight of responsibility and love settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. "Don't apologize, little one. You saved my life up there. Really, that bell trick was brilliant. Where did you learn to do that?" Elsie looked up at him with eyes that held both pride and sadness. "Mama used to tell me stories about clever girls who saved the day. She said intelligence was better than strength, and courage was better than both." Bear's throat tightened. "Your mama was a wise woman." "She was, and she was right about you too." "What did she say about me?" "That you were worth saving. That underneath all the hurt and anger, you were still the good man she fell in love with." The words hit Bear like a physical blow. In all his memories of those desperate days in Devil's Canyon, he'd never realized that Selena's feelings for him had gone deeper than gratitude or tactical alliance. "She fell in love with me?" he asked quietly. "She told me the night before she died. Said she wished she'd had more time to show you who you really were." Elsie's green eyes, so much like her mother's, blazed with fierce certainty. "But I can show you. I can help you remember." As they walked away from the church, leaving Calhoun's body for the undertaker and his men for the territorial marshal, Bear felt something fundamental shift inside him. The guilt and self-hatred that had driven him for so long were still there, but they were balanced now by something else: hope. The telegram arrived at the Yuma telegraph office on a Tuesday morning, crackling over the wires with news that would change everything. Bear was in his cell writing his weekly report for the federal prosecutors when Deputy Marshal Bradley appeared with the yellow paper in his hand. "McKinnon," Bradley said, his weathered face showing something that might have been respect. "Got news from Washington." Bear looked up from his writing, noting the formal tone in the deputy's voice. In the months since his first hunt, their relationship had evolved from wary suspicion to grudging professional courtesy. "Good news or bad news?" Bear asked. "Depends on your perspective." Bradley unfolded the telegram and read, "Vincent Calhoun confirmed dead. Last known associate of Crowley gang eliminated. Federal cooperation agreement complete. Sentence commuted to time served. Release authorized immediately." Bear stared at the deputy marshal, the words not quite registering. "I'm free. Free as a man can be with your history." Bradley folded the telegram and slipped it into his vest pocket. Course there's conditions. You're on parole for 5 years, can't leave the territory without permission, got to report to a federal marshal once a month. But I'm free. You're free. Bradley extended his hand, and Bear shook it with a grip that was firm but not crushing. For what it's worth, McKinnon, I think you earned it. Most men in your position would have run or died trying. You did neither. Bear gathered his few possessions, letters from Elsie, the pressed flower from Devil's Canyon, a small leather journal where he'd recorded his thoughts during the long nights in his cell. Everything else he'd owned before his imprisonment was gone, lost to the desert, or sold to pay for his crimes. What will you do now? Bradley asked as they walked toward the prison gates. I don't know, Bear admitted. I've got no money, no prospects, no place to call home. But I've got something I didn't have before. What's that? Bear looked up at the desert sky, vast and blue and full of possibility. A clean slate. A chance to build something decent from scratch. The gates of Yuma Prison swung open, and for the first time in over a year, Thaddeus McKinnon walked free under the Arizona sun. The sensation was overwhelming, the space, the choices, the terrible responsibility of freedom. Mrs. Winters was waiting for him in a buckboard wagon, her kind face creased with nervous smiles. Beside her sat Elsie, now 16 and beautiful, in the way that reminded Bear achingly of her mother. Mr. Bear. Elsie called out, jumping down from the wagon to embrace him with the fierce affection of someone who'd grown up too fast, but never lost her capacity for love. Hello, little one. Bear said, his voice rough with emotion. You've grown. I'm not little anymore, she said with mock dignity. I'm a woman now. Mrs. Winters says I'm old enough to make my own decisions. Bear looked at the older woman, reading the message in her eyes. Mrs. Winters had been more than a guardian to Elsie. She'd been a teacher, a mentor, a mother figure who'd helped heal the wounds left by Selena's death. But she was also practical enough to understand that Elsie's heart had never fully accepted the separation from her chosen protector. She's been counting the days until your release, Mrs. Winters said quietly. Planning what she wanted to say to you, what she wanted to ask. What do you want to ask, Elsie? Bear said gently. The young woman took a deep breath, her green eyes blazing with the same determination that had made her mother so formidable. I want to know if you'll stay. If you'll be my family officially this time. Bear's throat tightened. Elsie, I'm an ex-convict with no money and a reputation that follows me like a shadow. You deserve better than I deserve to choose my own family, she interrupted with quiet steel. And I choose you. I've always chosen you. Mrs. Winters climbed down from the wagon, her movements careful and deliberate. There's more, Mr. McKinnon. Things Elsie doesn't know about yet. She handed Bear an envelope thick with official seals and legal documents. Your federal cooperation brought down 3 major criminal organizations and led to the recovery of over $50,000 in stolen property. The territorial government has authorized a reward $10,000 plus a full pardon for all territorial crimes. Bear stared at the envelope, barely able to process what he was being told. $10,000, enough to buy a ranch, Mrs. Winters said with a knowing smile. Enough to build the life you always wanted. There's something else, Elsie added, her voice soft with emotion. Something I've been saving for when you got out. She reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a small wooden box worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a simple gold ring. It was Mama's, Elsie said quietly. Her wedding ring from her first marriage. She told me to keep it safe, said it represented the possibility of new beginnings. Bear looked at the ring, then at Elsie's face, reading the love and hope and desperate longing written there. Elsie, you're 16 years old. You should be thinking about school, about young men your own age. I'm thinking about family, she said firmly. about the man who kept his promise to my dying mother, who risked everything to keep me safe, who became the father I never had. The word hit Bear like a lightning bolt. Father. Not husband, not romantic partner, but father. The relationship he'd always wanted but never dared to claim. Is that what you want? He asked quietly. For me to be your father. It's what you've always been, Elsie replied. I just want to make it official. Mrs. Winters cleared her throat diplomatically. The territorial judge has agreed to handle the adoption papers. Given your service to law enforcement and Elsie's express wishes, he's prepared to approve the petition immediately. Bear looked around at the three women who'd somehow become his family. Mrs. Winters, with her practical kindness, Elsie with her fierce loyalty, and the memory of Selena that bound them all together. For the first time in his adult life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. All right, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Let's go home. The ranch they bought was small but well situated, with good water and grass that could support a modest herd of cattle. Bear threw himself into the work with the same determination he'd once brought to hunting outlaws, building corrals and mending fences, and slowly transforming the property into something approaching his old dreams. Elsie proved to be a natural ranch hand with her mother's intelligence and her own fierce independence. She handled the business side of their operation with the same skill Selena had shown, running her boarding house, keeping books, and negotiating with buyers, and slowly building relationships with their neighbors. The transition wasn't easy. Bear's reputation preceded him wherever he went, and there were those who would never accept that a former outlaw could truly change. But gradually, through hard work and honest dealing, the McKinnon Ranch began to earn respect in the community. You know what I think? Elsie said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. What's that? Bear asked, enjoying the peace of the moment. I think Mama would be proud of us, of what we've built together. Bear nodded, feeling the truth of her words in his bones. I think you're right. Do you ever regret it? The choices you made, the path that brought you here? Bear considered the question carefully. I regret the pain I caused the people I hurt. I regret that it took me so long to find my way back to who I was meant to be. But I don't regret where I ended up. Elsie smiled, her green eyes catching the last light of day. Neither do I. As night fell over the desert, father and daughter sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the life they'd built from the ashes of tragedy and loss. In the distance, coyotes called to each other with wild voices, but the sound held no menace now, just the natural music of a land at peace with itself. Bear McKinnon had finally found his way home. 5 years had passed since Bear's release from Yuma, and the McKinnon Ranch had grown from a modest homestead into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. Elsie, now 21 and beautiful in the way that turned heads wherever she went, had proven herself to be as formidable a businesswoman as her mother had been. The morning of her birthday dawned clear and bright, with the kind of desert sunshine that made everything seem possible. Bear was in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal, when he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, expecting company. He called to Elsie, who was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. Not that I know of, she replied. But there was something in her voice that made Bear look up sharply. The rider who approached their ranch was a young man Bear didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to success. He dismounted near the porch and removed his hat politely, revealing dark hair and intelligent eyes. Miss Morrison, he asked, his voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. It's McKinnon now, Elsie corrected, moving to stand beside Bear. Elsie McKinnon, this is my father, Thaddeus McKinnon. The young man's eyes widened with recognition. The Bear McKinnon I've heard stories about you, sir. About your work with the federal marshals. Bear studied the stranger carefully, noting the expensive clothes, the well-cared-for horse, the confident way he carried himself. You've got me at a disadvantage, son. You know my name, but I don't know yours. Thomas Brennan. The young man replied, extending his hand. My grandfather was Thomas Brennan of Sunfire Gulch. You helped save my cousin Sarah during the Black Dune Riders incident. Bear shook the offered hand, memories flooding back. Thomas Brennan, the elderly man who'd stood up for him during those difficult days after the rescue. How is your grandfather? He passed 2 years ago, sir. But he never forgot what you did for our family. Thomas's expression grew more serious. That's actually why I'm here. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather portfolio thick with documents and official seals. My grandfather left instructions in his will. He wanted me to find you to deliver this personally. Bear accepted the portfolio with growing confusion. What is it? A deed, Thomas replied. To the Sunfire Gulch property. All of it, the boarding house, the surrounding land, everything. Grandfather said it belonged to you by right. Elsie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The boarding house, Mama's boarding house. Your mother was Selena Morrison. Thomas asked gently. When Elsie nodded, his expression softened with understanding. Then this belongs to you as much as to your father. The whole town remembers what she did, how she died protecting others. There's something else. He reached into the portfolio and pulled out a smaller envelope sealed with wax and bearing Elsie's name in faded ink. Your mother left this. My grandfather kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment to deliver it. Elsie's hands trembled as she accepted the letter. The wax seal was cracked with age, but the paper inside was still legible. She read silently, tears streaming down her face, then looked up at Bear with eyes that blazed with love and loss and fierce determination. What does it say? Bear asked gently. She knew, Elsie whispered. Mama knew she might not survive, so she wrote this the night before the final battle. She wanted me to know that she loved you, that she saw the good man you were, even when you couldn't see it yourself. Bear's throat tightened. Elsie, there's more. She looked down at the letter again. She says the boarding house was always meant to be a place where lost souls could find their way home. She wants us to reopen it to carry on what she started. Thomas cleared his throat diplomatically. There's a practical consideration as well. The territorial government is offering a substantial subsidy for anyone willing to establish a way station on the Tucson-Phoenix route. The location is perfect, and with your reputation for honest dealing, Bear looked around at the ranch they'd built, at the life they'd carved from the desert through sweat and determination. It was everything he'd ever dreamed of. But Elsie's expression told him it wasn't everything she needed. What do you think? He asked her. It's your choice. I think, Elsie said slowly, that Mama was right. Some places are meant to welcome lost souls. She smiled, and in that expression, Bear saw echoes of Selena's fierce compassion. Besides, we're not abandoning the ranch. We're expanding our family business. Over the following months, they divided their time between the ranch and the boarding house, slowly renovating Selena's old establishment while maintaining their cattle operation. Elsie threw herself into the project with the same determination she'd shown in everything else, creating a place that was part hotel, part sanctuary, part symbol of hope for anyone who'd lost their way. The grand reopening of the Morrison house, as Elsie insisted on calling it, drew visitors from across the territory. Former outlaws seeking redemption, families displaced by violence, travelers who'd heard stories about the woman who'd died for justice, and the man who'd found salvation in keeping her memory alive. But the most important visitor arrived on a dusty Tuesday afternoon in late spring. Bear was working in the garden behind the boarding house when he heard Elsie's sharp intake of breath. Papa, she said, using the name she'd adopted for him years ago. Look. Bear straightened up to see a familiar figure approaching on foot, his clothes dusty from long travel, his face weathered by years of hard living. The man was older, grayer, but unmistakably recognizable. Sheriff Tom Morrison, no relation to Selena, despite the shared name, had been among the posse that rescued them from Devil's Canyon all those years ago. Now he stood in their garden, hat in hand, with the expression of someone carrying heavy news. "Sheriff Morrison," Bear said, offering his hand. "This is a surprise. What brings you to Sunfire Gulch?" "Retirement, mostly," Morrison replied with a weary smile. "But also unfinished business. I've got something that belongs to you." He reached into his travel bag and pulled out a small wooden box, similar to the one that had held Selena's ring. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was a sheriff's badge. "The territorial governor authorized this 5 years ago," Morrison explained. "Said any man who'd done as much for law and order as you had deserved the chance to make it official. But I wasn't sure you'd want it." Bear stared at the badge, feeling the weight of symbolism and responsibility it represented. "Sheriff McKinnon, if you want it. Sunfire Gulch's growing needs proper law enforcement. The town council's already approved the appointment, unanimously, I might add." Elsie stepped forward, her green eyes shining with pride and love. "What do you think, Papa, ready to make it official?" Bear looked around at the boarding house they'd rebuilt at the town that had slowly learned to trust them, at the daughter who'd become his anchor and his inspiration. Then he looked down at the badge that represented everything he'd once been and everything he'd chosen to become. "I think," he said quietly, "it's time to finish what we started." The ceremony was simple, but meaningful. The same judge who'd handled Elsie's adoption administered the oath, while the townspeople gathered to witness the transformation of an outlaw into their protector. When Bear pinned the badge to his vest, he felt the weight of years of struggle and redemption settling into something like peace. That evening, as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Elsie leaned against her father's shoulder with the comfortable affection of someone who'd never doubted where she belonged. "Do you think she can see us?" Elsie asked softly. "Mama, I mean, do you think she knows how things turned out?" Bear was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the woman who'd died believing in his capacity for good, who'd entrusted him with her most precious gift, who'd somehow known that love could transform even the most broken soul. "I think," he said finally, "that she's been watching over us all along. I think she knew exactly how this would end." As if in response to his words, a gentle breeze stirred the desert sage, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of rain. In the distance, a church bell tolled the evening hour, its bronze voice echoing off the canyon walls with the sound of hope made manifest. Thaddeus Bear McKinnon had finally found his way home, not to a place, but to a purpose. He'd spent years running from his past, then years trying to atone for it. Now, surrounded by the family he'd chosen and the community that had chosen him, he understood that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a way of life. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and terrible, and full of possibility. But here in this small sanctuary they'd built from love and loss, and the unshakable belief that people could change the wasteland had bloomed. And in that blooming, Selena Morrison's sacrifice had finally borne its intended fruit, a world where lost souls could find their way home, where broken people could heal, where love could triumph over the longest odds. The McKinnons sat in comfortable silence as night fell over Sunfire Gulch, father and daughter united by tragedy, strengthened by adversity, and bound together by the simple truth that family isn't about blood or birth certificates. It's about the promises we make and the love we choose to honor, even when the cost seems too high to bear. In the end, Bear McKinnon had learned the most important lesson of all: some promises are worth dying for, but the best ones are worth living for.